Hi, thanks for joining us today for a special presentation hosted by the ARC of Texas. My name is Carrie Axtell, and I'm the Advocacy and Youth Programs Director at the ARC of Fort Bend County. We're a local chapter of the ARC focused on grassroots advocacy, parent and sibling support, and we also offer a variety of social and recreational programs for youth, teens, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about us and our work, please visit our website at arcoffortbend.org, and you can follow us on our social media. But during our presentation today, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and I will share them with our presenter at the end. But it is my pleasure to introduce Sabrina Gonzalez Saucedo, the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy with the ARC of Texas. Sabrina has a deep passion for disability rights. Prior to joining the ARC of Texas, she was a public policy analyst at the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities. And she's also served as a public policy fellow at the Disability Justice Initiative and also with the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions in Washington, D.C. So she has an extensive passion and history for the topic here today. So we're so glad that you're able to join us. Sabrina, she's going to be sharing the ARC of Texas's public policy priorities as the 89th Texas legislative session gets underway, and just talk about how these initiatives can aim to help create positive change for people with IDD across the state. Welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for that introduction. And Carrie is just right. The ARC of Texas is gearing up for our legislative session, which has just begun, the 89th. And I'm really excited that the ARC of Fort Bend County and the members that are associated with the ARC of Fort Bend County are interested in public policy and getting involved in advocacy. It's incredibly important to be able to connect with your elected officials to try and drive the change that we want to see in our state and across the country related to Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so that starts with us. So if you may not be familiar with the ARC of Texas, I know you're familiar with the ARC of Fort Bend County, but the ARC of Texas is a statewide advocacy organization that promotes, protects, and advocates for the human rights and self-determination of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have over 20 local chapters, including the ARC of Fort Bend County, all over the state. And our local chapters really are that grassroots effort that connect with families and Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities directly. And so we are endlessly grateful for the work that Fort Bend County, the ARC of Fort Bend County, and our local chapters do to connect with folks on the ground. The ARC of Texas takes a wider view and tries to connect with the legislature and our elected officials to try and drive policy change that is in the best interest of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families so that they can thrive. So with that being said, I will share that this past summer, the ARC of Texas engaged in a listening session and tour across our state called the Tour Across Texas. Understanding that we have lots of local chapters all over the state, we wanted to make it a priority for us to visit our local chapters where they're at, including the ARC of Fort Bend County. And so we went and engaged in listening session and conducting legislative advocacy trainings so that parents and members of our local chapters of the ARC felt empowered to be able to engage in legislative advocacy. And so on this tour across Texas, we really got the opportunity to listen to our members and hear what those top high priorities issues are. What are the top issues that are impacting Texans with IDD and their families? And from that, we compiled what is our platform and our priorities for this upcoming legislative session. But what is the legislative session? What is the legislature? What happens in Austin? What happens at the Capitol? That's kind of a big overarching question for some folks that are new to advocacy. And that could be its own, hour-long, day-long, training seminar. But speaking in broad strokes, what we have been the top things to know are that the Texas legislature meets every other year or biennially in order to come together, prepare a state budget, and decide how Texas is using taxpayer dollars, and to vote and amend state law and code. Those are two incredibly huge responsibilities, and there are elected officials from Fort Bend County and all over the state that come to Austin to make those really big decisions. And so, those legislative sessions, or time when that occurs, happens for 140 days every other year. And so that time is upon us right now. We are at the beginning of the 89th legislative session. And for this session, we have over 25 new members of the Texas House and 2 new state senators. In the past week, the House of Representatives just elected their new Speaker of the House, Speaker Dustin Burrows. And when we're thinking about budget and how much money the legislature has to play with this legislative session, we got an update from our state comptroller, Glenn Hager, who projects that the state will have a $20 billion surplus at the start of the 89th legislative session. So that's a little background information to know what we're walking into for this upcoming session. The ARC of Texas has 4 policy pillars that we really believe are the most important to quality of life of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We understand and believe that every single policy decision or conversation that is happening at the Capitol is going to impact Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And so we don't just focus on education policy or criminal justice or home and community-based services. We do our best to engage in all of those conversations because people with IDD are impacted by all of these policy conversations. With that being said, we divide our priorities based on pillars. And these are those main kind of components that the ARC of Texas focuses on. The first one is quality of life. Under this pillar, we consider a lot of the priorities that are related to home and community-based services, Medicaid waivers, and trying to make sure that Texans with IDD have the supports that they need in order to thrive and live in their communities of choice. And so quality of life takes up a lot of the priorities of the ARC of Texas. And after that, we have inclusive education. Inclusive education is incredibly important because, as we know, there are lots of young families that are navigating the special education system and find it very difficult to do so. It is not an easy process. Thankfully, the ARC of Fort Bend County has immense resources and supports for families that are going through that process. So I definitely recommend you reaching out to them if you have any questions. But inclusive education is definitely one because we believe that ultimately students with disabilities deserve to be able to receive a appropriate and proper education in their locally zoned public school. Civil rights and justice is our next policy pillar. We believe that Texans with IDD should have equitable access to justice and services within their community so that they're less likely to be victims of abuse or crime and more likely to participate civically. In this pillar, we also think about voting, which is a very common topic in this space, and ensuring that people with IDD maintain their ability to vote privately and that right is protected. And our last pillar is integrated employment. We believe that work is fundamental to adult life and that Texans with IDD have skills that the workforce needs, and that the state of Texas should be doing everything it can to promote competitive and integrated employment opportunities for Texans with IDD. So these are our longstanding policy pillars that exist throughout all of the legislative sessions. And given our tour across Texas, what we heard from our families, we went ahead and got more specific into each of these public policy priorities and named out some priorities within each pillar. And so for the 89th legislative session, we have 3 priorities under each pillar. Some of these may be very familiar to you, some of them may not, but if you have any questions, I encourage you to throw some questions into the chat. I'll start off with quality of life. Overwhelmingly, something that we heard from our members and folks across the state was that there is not nearly enough access to home and community-based services. You may be, such as my family is one of the over 175,000 Texans with IDD that are sitting on a wait list waiting for access to a Medicaid waiver program like HCS or CLASS or another waiver. And it is one of our top priorities this session to increase access to home and community-based services and reduce those wait times. Folks are waiting up to 15 years or more before they are offered a Medicaid waiver slot. And we know that we cannot allow our families and Texans with IDD to wait that long, because then folks end up in crisis and unfortunately end up in either our criminal justice system or in our state-supported living centers. We find that it is absolutely important that our state invest those resources to increasing access to home and community-based services to avoid crisis situations for our families. In that same breath, we also understand and acknowledge that there is a really dire attendant direct care workforce crisis. Attendant workers, direct care professionals are really the fundamental building blocks of the ability for Texans with IDD to be able to live in their communities with their families and friends and with their loved ones. And we also realize that the wages that the legislature has set for attendant care is not sufficient in order to keep that workforce strong. Currently, attendants are paid $10.60 an hour, and that wage is woefully low to meet the demands of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we ask the legislature to strengthen the direct care workforce this legislative session. And finally, our last priority under quality of life is asking the legislature to expand access to mental health services for Texans with IDD. The ARC of Texas is definitely understanding that there is a lot of overlap between folks that have IDD and folks that have mental health conditions. And oftentimes, people with IDD have very limited opportunities or options when they're seeking access to mental health care. And so the ARC of Texas has identified one specific model that has worked really well at trying to serve this population, called the outpatient biopsychosocial approach or model. We call it OBI for short. And this OBI model really is an attempt to meet people with IDD where they're at and give them holistic care and services to meet their mental health needs. Currently, we have 5 local IDD authorities that are providing OBI services. And this legislative session, we're asking the legislature to expand OBI services to be offered at all 39 of the local IDD authorities and expand that access all over the state. So those are our priorities under quality of life. Moving forward, we have our next pillar, which is inclusive education. And one of our top priorities under inclusive education is equitable funding for special education. The special education funding formula that is currently used by the state of Texas hasn't been updated in over 25 years, and unfortunately doesn't get at the true cost of educating students with disabilities. It views special education as though it's a place and not a set of services that a student receives. And so we're asking the legislature to implement the Special Education Funding Commission's recommendation to update that funding formula and shift to an intensity of needs-based funding model that addresses each child's educational needs. In addition to that, we are asking the legislature to promote inclusive and safe school environments. What we mean by that is addressing the disproportionate physical restraints that students with disabilities experience by enhancing training for educators on effective positive behavior intervention strategies and de-escalation. In addition to that, we also want school districts and the legislature, we want the legislature to ensure that students with disabilities are fully included in school safety and emergency planning efforts. We have heard time and time again that students with disabilities are often left behind or their needs are not considered whenever schools are doing their emergency plannings, whether it be for a fire drill or an active shooter drill or other sort of emergencies that do emerge on campus. And so we want to ensure that school districts are taking the needs of students with disabilities into account when they are creating these plans to ensure their safety. And lastly, under the education pillar, we are asking the legislature to expand access to inclusive higher education. This is an extremely exciting priority for me personally. I have a sister with an intellectual disability who lives down in the Rio Grande Valley, and she is 21 years old. And we have been in that process of looking for inclusive higher education opportunities that could meet her future employment needs. Unfortunately, there are very few and far between inclusive higher education options across the state, but they are popping up with more prevalence across the state. Some of you may be familiar with some of the more well-known programs such as Texas A&M University's Aggie Achieve program, University of Texas at Austin's E4 program, the University of North Texas's WISE program. These are some examples of really stellar inclusive higher education opportunities that are specifically tailored for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to try and prepare them for life after graduation and employment. Competitive integrated employment. And so we're asking the legislature to expand access to inclusive higher education and incentivize institutions of higher education to create more of those programs on their campuses. And that wraps up our inclusive education priorities. So we're halfway through our pillars. Moving forward to competitive integrated employment, we wholeheartedly support the legislature in promoting competitive and integrated employment opportunities for Texans with IDD. We, as I mentioned, believe that Texans with IDD have skills that the workforce needs and that work is fundamental to adult life. And so ensuring that the legislature is promoting access to competitive integrated employment is crucial for the ARC of Texas. We ask the legislature to enhance employment support services and peer support. We understand that Texans with IDD do require additional interventions or services or time in order to achieve employment and competitive integrated employment specifically. And so we ask the legislature to invest in those opportunities. And best practices such as peer support opportunities for Texans with IDD to work in our really thriving workforce in Texas. And we are also asking the legislature to eliminate barriers to employment. We know that oftentimes there are unintended barriers that exist for Texans with IDD to engage or be employed in our state. And so we ask the legislature to eliminate those barriers and promote competitive integrated employment as an option for Texans with IDD. Lastly, our last pillar and priorities related to our priorities are related to civil rights and justice. So this has been coming up or been really often in the news recently related to a very prominent case that has been happening here in Texas related to the case of Robert Roberson. Robert Roberson is a man with autism who is currently sitting on Texas's death row for a crime that he did not commit. This case has brought up the really important question of how is it that we are determining when a person that is incarcerated has an intellectual disability and what rights they have as a person with IDD when they are incarcerated or become involved with the criminal legal system. We think that it is really important that the state define and establish an appropriate process for identifying people with IDD when they are involved with the criminal legal system, and to create a straightforward path for identification and alerting guardians when they are in custody, if they are in custody. Moving forward, we ask the legislature to promote self-determination and rights of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Oftentimes, the rights of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not respected in the same way as they are for their non-disabled or neurotypical peers or Texans. And so we ask the legislature to ensure that the rights of Texans with IDD are upheld. And lastly, our last priority under civil rights and justice is asking the legislature to uphold existing voting rights. We understand that the right to vote is essential for every citizen of the state of Texas in the United States to be able to take part in the legislative process and the election process. And so we ask the legislature in considering voting rights laws or voting laws to ensure that the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to vote still exist, and there's not an unnecessary or unintentional burden placed or barrier placed for Texans with IDD to get that opportunity to vote. And so these are our priorities for this legislative session. We definitely have our hands full and have a lot of different, policy areas that we're going to be weighing in on and chiming in on, and ensuring that the legislature and the relevant committees that hear these or have conversations, debates, policy conversations about these issues hear what Texans with IDD and their families, with the ARC of Texas, with the ARC of Fort Bend, and our members have to say about these stories. And so that is a really broad overview of what our priorities are for this session. I also want to point folks in the direction of some of the advocacy resources that we have created and that exist on the ARC of Texas's website, and also something I can follow up with in an email. So we have a one-pager that outlines what these public policy priorities for the 89th legislative session are. And we also have created a one-pager on an advocacy toolkit that explains a little bit about what I was discussing with you about what the Texas legislature is, what legislators do when they meet, how legislators pass laws, and more. And so I definitely recommend folks check out our website for more advocacy resources and to get started on your advocacy journey or continue. And I'm also going to plug that the ARC of Texas is actively trying to connect with our members in Fort Bend County and everywhere across the state and invite people to be involved in this process, because we know that the stories of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their family stories are critical and really impactful when the legislature is meeting and deciding on these really important decisions. And so this session, we're going to be connecting with our members through our email distribution list, with a legislative newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks to give folks an update on what is happening in Austin, and also on our social media pages. We're going to be posting opportunities for when the public has the opportunity to engage and submit public comments or come to the Capitol, or submit them virtually. And so advocacy opportunity alerts are going to be distributed through our distribution list on email and also through our social media channels. So definitely keep in touch through those ways with the ARC of Texas throughout session. But in addition to that, we also have opportunities for the public to come and meet us here at the Capitol. So the ARC of Fort Bend County is just one of the chapters that's going to be joining us on Meet the ARC Day at the Texas Capitol next Friday. And this is going to be an opportunity for folks to come into the Capitol and connect with their elected officials, sit down and have a meeting with them and tell them what their priorities are for legislative session, and ask them as their constituent, as the person that lives in their district, to prioritize the needs of Texans with IDD and their families. Very similarly, every Valentine's Day, the ARC of Texas's hosts have a Heart for the ARC Day, and this is our statewide advocacy event where we ask the legislature to have a heart for Texans with IDD. And specifically this session, we are asking the legislature to focus on the needs of Texans with IDD and their families, and to focus on strengthening the direct care workforce. So we're asking the legislature to increase those wages from $10.60 an hour to a livable wage. And that is our priority for Have a Heart for the ARC. We're going to be distributing more information about how folks can attend and take part in Have a Heart for the ARC, either in Fort Bend County or wherever you are in the state, or in Austin in the coming weeks. So again, I will plug the opportunity to follow us on social media and be subscribed to our email list. And with that, that concludes my presentation, but I am open to any questions that may have come up as a result of what I've shared so far.
Yeah, Sabrina, I will say that the legislative newsletter that you put out, so informative and helpful. I really appreciate that. I know you guys just sent out an edition not too long. I think it's like a day or two ago, just sent another one out. And so if you have not subscribed to that yet, definitely do, because it can be overwhelming to try to keep track of that stuff on your own. And just what the ARC of Texas does is really help to summarize that and keep you still informed of what's going on. And then if you aren't a member of the ARC of Fort Bend, please join us, because through your membership with us, you then automatically become the ARC of member of the ARC of Texas, and we keep you updated and informed of what's going on at the statewide. And then of course, also a member of the ARC of the United States. So you kind of are aware of what's going on at the federal level as well. So great benefit to membership. Join us. We'd love to see you and be a part of it. And we're very excited about coming next Friday. We actually have 2 families that we'll be bringing with us, Sabrina, and we did receive a confirmation from Senator Lois Kolkhorst's office. We do have a confirmation, so I'll get offline and talk to you more about that. But it looks like we'll be meeting with they're at the Capitol with Lois Kolkhorst's staff, and then also with Matt Morgan's staff there on.
Amazing.
Yes, we're excited. Very excited. So I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but just kind of thinking out loud myself. So I know we don't have any particular bills maybe yet. I know there's been plenty that have been filed, but walk us through just kind of what's going to be happening over the next couple of months, and then how can people become involved?
Yeah, great question. So some of the updates that we have currently, so there are definitely bills that have already been filed. And so every legislative session, there are literally thousands of bills that are filed. And naturally, legislators only have 140 days for a bill to make it all the way through that process. So not all of them move. And so the ARC of Texas actively is tracking bills that have been filed now and are trying to piece out, what are the things that are actually going to be moving, and to meet with legislative offices to ask about, these are some, tell us more about this bill. We're really supportive of this bill, or we have some recommendations about this bill. That's kind of the place that we're at currently in session. And hearings for budget conversations have already started to trickle in. And so just yesterday, the Senate Finance Committee put a bunch of meetings out, meeting alerts on the books, and they will begin to meet in the next 2 weeks. The budget process is incredibly lengthy and starts much earlier than when other committees start to meet. And so that is already beginning. The House and the Senate have both put out their first drafts of what the budget will look like. And so the ARC of Texas is actively looking for where Texans with IDD are addressed in that bill. And so the specific budgetary portions that we're looking at are wages for increasing the number of waiver slots for Texans with IDD. We are looking at the rates for community attendance, and we're looking at access to mental health care for Texans with IDD and what those numbers are. And so in this first draft for the House bill and the Senate bill, both versions have offered for their first draft, increasing the starting wage for community attendance from $10.60 an hour, which is what it currently is, up to $12 an hour. So this is not the increase that we are expecting or think will be enough to really make a meaningful impact to address the direct care workforce crisis. However, this is, I will say, the first draft, and I think a good starting point for negotiations. I think that when Texans with IDD meet with their legislators and talk about what these changes would mean, it's really impactful and can help move the needle on moving those wages for the important direct care workers that support Texans with IDD. And so hearings for other committees and for bills outside of the budget are most likely going to begin in the first weeks of March. We already have the Senate committee appointments, or we know who is serving on the Senate committees. However, the House has not released that yet. And so we expect for the House to release their members of committees in the coming weeks. Given that we have a new speaker, it is really up in the air to see as to how those committees are going to look. So we might have some folks that are new to committees, new offices that we have to introduce ourselves to, or give overviews about our community to, but we intend for those lists in the House for committees to be public in the coming weeks.
All right. Well, thank you for that insight. That definitely helps to kind of know the process and what's going on. And it changes so quickly too,
Yes.
right? I mean, we kind of have an idea, but then, so what would be probably the fastest way to kind of keep up with if there is an urgent item or something that we need to either send a letter or emails to our legislators? What would be the best way to keep in contact about that?
That's a great question, and I really appreciated your point earlier, Carrie, that a lot of times it is very overwhelming to try and track the legislature. And luckily for you, I get paid every day so that I can track this for our members in the Arc of Fort Bend County and across the state. And so, again, subscribing to our emails is really that quickest way to hear that. Whenever there are really urgent or emergent items that come up, the Arc of Texas sends out something called advocacy opportunity alerts, both on our email list and on our social media accounts. So following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of it. We're on all of it. But we offer those opportunities. And in those opportunities, we tell people in very concise language what is happening, how to engage if the opportunity exists, if in the House, to either send a letter or to use the House public comment portal. We share that. And we also provide our members with proposed draft language that they can use and tailor to craft their message. We understand that not everyone, especially our parents, are not going to have 3 hours free in their day in order to draft a lengthy, handwritten note or letter about this process. But the Arc of Texas wants to make that as accessible as possible for families and for advocates. So we provide draft language that you can use and also add to with your personal story. Again, those personal stories are so impactful. And so subscribing and looking out for those advocacy opportunity alerts when we send them is a really great way to get involved in the process.
Right. Well, Sabrina, thank you so much for providing just what we're looking at, what the pillars are, and breaking that down for us and how we can keep in contact with you all to be involved.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for being engaged. I appreciate everyone for tuning in and for registering. And please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions about how to get involved this legislative session.
All right. Well, thank you all. We'll see you later.
Thank you.